Water and Sanitation Deputy Minister David Mahlobo said water levels at Gauteng metros are critically low. On Wednesday, Mahlobo assessed the extent of water challenges in Ekurhuleni and Pretoria. This after large parts of Gauteng were crippled by water shortages in recent weeks. Well, let's speak to Professor Mike Muller, a visiting Adjunct Professor in the University of Witwatersrand, for some more insights on this. Now, let's talk about climate change, Professor. Now, you wrote a paper, 2007, I believe, that speaks to the increased weather-related risks due to global warming. Now, how do these findings, in your opinion, align with the volatile water levels in Gauteng's municipal reservoirs and the associated risks?
Yes, I mean, it's very interesting trying to link what happened, in the long term and what happens day to day. So back, 15 years ago, we could already see that, the climate was going to get warmer, rains were going to get a little bit less predictable and probably heavier, and this was going to affect the way we ran our water supplies. But, those factors that we looked at, and they're beginning to happen, they happen slowly, but they don't explain, why the water goes off for a few hours in Johannesburg a week ago. And I think it's very important for us to keep an eye on the long term, because it was before 2007 that we said we really need to build the Lesotho Highlands Phase 2, and it must be ready by 2015. And we can say that until 2028, the Lesotho Highlands Phase 2 project won't be ready. So in that long-term view, what does that mean for yesterday and today and the next few weeks? I think people get very confused between these different time frames.
Now, we're talking about 15 years ago when you were Director of Water, if my memory serves me right. Now, 15 years later, very little has been done to deal with some of these issues. The infrastructure remains the same. It is outdated, it is unable to deal with the huge populations. What's actually the problem with dealing with the infrastructure or building fresh infrastructure, particularly when all this was seen 15 years ago?
Okay, so if we look at the big problem, is there going to be enough water for all the people in Gauteng? Now, back then, there was about 8 million people in Gauteng. In the next few years, it'll be double. It'll be over 16 million. So you've got the same amount of water, because back in 2004-05, we finished the last phase of Phase 1B of Lesotho Highlands, and the next lot of water that's coming in will come from Phase 2. It will only be ready in 2028. It should have been ready a lot earlier. What's happening in between times is, first of all, the good news. Twice as many people, and still most of us have got water. This isn't an ESCOM. We've had built in some capacity, and it's lasted us quite well. But for the next few years, we've got that same amount of water, probably another 1.5 million people, and how are we going to share it out between everybody and make sure it goes round? So for me, the big problem is, can the cities now manage much better than they have in the past to share the water out fairly between people and make sure that we don't get cut off for weeks on end, as has been happening in a few places?
So when we talk about financing the infrastructure, does the government have the necessary financial resources to do it, or do we go to the polluter pays principle, which talks about the adaptation in line with the polluter pays? And how can this principle be applied to mobilize financial resources for climate-proofing Gauteng's water infrastructure? Well,
the good news is, unless you're a ratepayer in Gauteng and a water payer in Gauteng, the users are going to pay for the Lesotho Highlands water scheme. They're going to pay with over very long term. The loans are sort of 20, 25 years. They're at good rates because they come from international development organizations. But the users will have to pay for that extra water. Similarly, in the city, the users are going to have to pay for the infrastructure that needs to be fixed. But here's the good news. It's less about how much new infrastructure we build and much more about how we use that existing infrastructure. There's quite a lot of it. It works quite well. Reservoirs in Yeoville, Johannesburg have been standing up for more than 100 years and they still work. The point is, though, that as you get the amount of water available shared between more people, you've got to manage it much better. You really can't afford to have losses. You can't afford to have one suburb having a lot while another suburb up the top of the hill is dry. So I think we're going to have to get our municipalities really jacked up so that they can share the water that we have, which should be enough even till 2028, but share it fairly and squarely between everyone, and also explain what they're doing. We don't want situations where, a whole suburb of Johannesburg or Tshwane or Ekurhuleni goes without water for 2 weeks and nobody explains what has happened. Oh, we should have realized that's a bit high. We should have put more water in that reservoir. That won't do. The municipalities have got to get their act together, and they're going to have work to do.
Now, earlier we talked about Deputy Minister David Mahlobo, who was in Ekurhuleni and Pretoria, and taking a look at some of the challenges, speaking to the municipalities. And it seems that we now have the Department of Water going into the respective municipalities to offer some form of assistance. Do the municipalities have capacity to deal with the water challenges?
Look, it's their basic job to do it. They've got the money to do it. I mean, I don't know what their politicians are always doing, because they seem to be changing every second day, and that's a large part of the problem. Can they just put the qualified people who we have? And this is not about old white people like myself. There's plenty of, qualified black practitioners now. Can we just put qualified people in place and give them the support they need? And funnily enough, you'll find that they'll be able to do it. So Deputy Minister Mahlobo was talking about, the need for infrastructure, but particularly the need for the municipalities to get their acts together. And I think that's a very important start. The next thing they've got to do, they've got to start talking to you and me. I mean, we live in this area. We pay their salaries through our water bills. Can they please tell us what they're doing to make sure there's enough water in all parts of our cities so that we have enough to use? And if they know that there's households which are using too much, let them do what Cape Town did during the Day Zero crisis, which was, a very big wake-up call to everybody. Let them tell us where the water is being excessively used and where people are behaving themselves and using a reasonable amount. I think we can learn from Cape Town's experience. They had to do it the hard way. Let's learn from them and try and get people to behave better. The other thing is that, of course, if water is flowing reliably and people see a leak, they'll be willing to call it in, as long as they know that the municipality will come quickly and fix it. So I really think what we need to see over the next 3 or 4 years, in fact until 2028, much better cooperation between the municipality and you and me, the water users, and together I think we can work together to get through this. But we do have to remember, going back to where you started, we've had some very good rains for the last 3 years. The warning is that we might be going into 3 dry years, so let's start right now. Let's not cry and say, let's pump more water from the system. Let's rather cry and say, municipalities, let's work together to use what we have better, because that way we'll get through to 2028 if we're lucky.
So are we in a crisis as far as the water is concerned? And I'd like you to call a spade a spade. We are battling to supply water, or the municipalities are battling to supply water when we do have adequate water in our dams and obviously in our reservoirs. But when you talk about 3 years of drought and we're failing where we have water, are we faced with a crisis, Professor?
My colleagues in the international water sector always said that, the next world war will be about water unless we manage our water better. So, sure, we could have a water crisis if the municipalities do not get their act together and start working properly and working much more intensively to tell people what they're doing and what they need you and me to do. We could well face a crisis, because we always plan, and I'm talking with my old hat as a national sort of manager, we always plan in case there's a drought. That's why the dams are full, but you're being told you can't take too much more, because that's how much Rand water is allowed to pump. And if they pump too much, then if there's a drought next year, we'll be in trouble. So we've got to live within that constraint, but there's enough water in the system, even if we have 3 dry years, to get us through. But it depends on those municipalities getting their act together. And I think the good thing over the last few days is you've seen the Minister and the Deputy Minister calling the municipalities and Rand Water to order and saying, stop waving fingers at each other. You know, Tshwane sometimes says all the water goes to Joburg. Joburg says that Ekurhuleni is getting too much. Can we all sit round the table, tell us how much water each is supposed to get, how much water each is using, and then the citizens, you and me, the water users, we can start responding appropriately. And I can promise you, we'll look in the road, and if we see a water leak that lasts for more than 24 hours, we'll be shouting at the mayor and the municipal manager. So I think that's the way to go forward. I don't think there needs to be a crisis, but there will be a crisis if we don't start working together and doing the job properly.
Professor, I appreciate you unpacking those issues for us. Professor Mike Muller, former DG of Water Affairs and visiting adjunct professor at the Wits School of Governance.